Hi there guys, it's Sandra again. Welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 2.1. Today we'll be talking about soil ecology and the soil food web. First of all, we'll describe what is ecology, the interaction between organisms within an ecosystem. So we'll define this concept of ecology. We'll talk about the plant-microbe interdependence, the importance of those two components of the ecological community to function well together, as well as the soil organic matter and how it actually influences that plant-microbe interaction, as well as how important it is in feeding organisms, but also in how it helps to form the soil habitat. So we'll end the lesson on soil habitat and what that habitat should look like in order to support optimum plant growth. Okay, let's jump into lesson 2.1. So this is what soil habitat looks like. So we've got a root, and we've got some microarthropods, tiny microscopic little organisms that are already insect-like or have 8 legs like arachnids. And sometimes there's insect larvae and all kinds of things. Of course, there's nematodes going through eating bacteria. There's all kinds of creatures that are not even pictured here. But importantly, we have fungal hyphae growing around the roots and from the roots, very essential in forming the habitat. Organic matter, which glues particles together and is food for all the microbes. That's very essential as well, that we'll talk about. And the organisms. So as I said, nematodes. There's also ciliate here, so a tiny little microscopic creature. And that shows you a human hair comparison as to the scale. And of course, in a little micro scale, we've also got different types of bacteria. So this is what it looks like, and this is what we'll be talking about. So basically, I've really zoned in on this one review, which is called Harnessing the Benefits of Soil Biology in Conservation Agriculture. And this is a part of a book by Agronomy Australia and Charles Sturt University. So I highly recommend getting this PDF and looking at it for yourself if you're interested. So while the entire course is structured around not just agricultural practices, but also conservation of natural habitats or native habitats, the principles apply. So it's the same principles whether we're looking at soil when we're revegetating, trying to conserve a habitat, trying to grow plants for agricultural systems. In any sort of situation, all of this information is the same. This is why it applies to so many different soil uses. So this soil, it is the 1 meter skin of the earth, sustaining all life forms in the terrestrial ecosystem, vital to the very existence and substance of human life. Dick 2018. I should have said topsoil really here, because it is really that most lively layer right at the top of the soil surface, between the very surface and where the root zone is, but particularly that 1 meter is of interest to us. But within the top 10 centimeters is where we sample from, and we can actually see all these life forms that we'll be talking about in detail over the coming weeks. It is basically made up of biological entities, of microbial communities. So it is individuals making up communities, just like people make up cities and make up organizations and so on. It's really how the organisms interact together with one another and with the plant that matters. In 1 kilogram of soil, we can see over 1 billion bacterial cells and over 2 kilometers of fungal hyphae. And over 95% of soil microbes are non-culturable. This means we can't put them in a petri dish and store them in the lab. They will not grow without all the other organisms actually present. So this is where we can't put things in bottles and sell them. Individually, it makes no sense. And we can't actually study things in isolation. Everything in soil and in the habitat that we live in, and our body is the same. Everything works together in unison as a system. We cannot take individual components out of the system and try to learn about them individually, because it doesn't work. Nature is not designed in that way. So what we need to learn is to look at this picture on the right and understand that we're looking at a whole system where everything works symbiotically, produces specific compounds for one another by the way they live. And this is why we can't isolate something and say, okay, grow for us. It can't, because it depends on so many other factors that are dependent on the other organisms that are present in its ecosystem. So this is a very vital point to remember. So soil ecology is actually the interactions between organisms and their environment. And the soil food web is a complex of interactions between soil organisms, plants, and animals. So the soil food web is basically how these organisms interact, how they feed each other, and how everything that's being produced by this feeding mechanism and the strata between them, the different tiers of their function, and how that feeds back into the plant, and vice versa, how the plant feeds the system. So the function in the soil's ecosystem is basically to break down organic matter and cycle nutrients. And from that, everything else can happen above ground. None of this can occur without the breakdown of the organic matter, without the organic matter being present, without the minerals we spoke about being present in the first instance, the microbes breaking those down, those organisms being fed upon, releasing those nutrients and cycling those nutrients through the entire Earth's ecosystem. So it is soil health, fertility, and climate regulation, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. That's what basically makes up soil ecology. How healthy the soil is, how fertile it is, how it actually fully regulates our climatic conditions through the carbon cycle, the biodiversity that it provides below and underground, and the ecosystem services that provides to the entire existence of the earth, really. It is about how we then manage those systems, both in agriculture and ecosystem management goes under this. So really, soil ecology depends on humans because we use soil so much. And in the image on the right, you can see how this is dependent also on the climatic conditions, on the abiotic conditions like moisture and temperature, and how many and what kind of plants are growing and how can they influence that system underground, depending on what food they provide for the microbes, how they photosynthesize, what other nutrients they provide, what microbes they can feed, and that whole interaction, ecological interaction underground, how these organisms function together to then feed that plant. And of course, I'm always going to drive this concept of biodiversity. We need a plethora of different plant families and groups. We need to constantly think about how to increase the biodiversity of the plant community in order to get as much microbial diversity and community structure as possible underground. And of course, underground, you can see the effects start from the microbial world as to how organic matter and the plant sugars or exudates are actually manipulated and used by the microorganisms, and then what organisms feed on the microbes, and then what organisms feed on the organisms that feed on the microbes, and then what organisms feed on the plant directly, which is also possible, and how that all fits together and forms this incredible ecosystem that we call soil. So the plant is the key because it is the giver, the primary producer of photosynthetic compounds given to the microbial world through its roots as simple sugars and other things like amino acids that we call exudates. So this word we'll be using quite a lot, exudate. The plants actually don't have a really amazing root system that is thin enough to access a lot of the nooks and crannies where the microbes are actually getting the mineral from the rock or sand, silt, or clay. So that means that really plants can't themselves really access nutrients from the soil very much, unless of course we apply nutrients in large amounts and force feed the plant because it's just surviving, so it's just trying to get the bare minimal that it can survive on, which happens in agriculture. So really the plant relies on these microbial organisms, fungi and bacteria, to get these nutrients, but also further, it really relies on the organisms that can release those nutrients from the microbes, from the fungi and from the bacteria. And this is the soil food web starting to emerge here now. So the plant releases 30 to 40% of sugars to feed the soil fungi and bacteria. It needs them. In exchange for these minerals that it's going to get from the fungi and bacteria, it actually gets the sugar, the simple sugars, the exudates to those organisms and chooses thereby which organisms will be attracted by the flavor, so to speak, of the sugar compounds that it produces. And it actually invests in the microbes. So because it gives so much of its sugar component that it photosynthesized, it actually invests in these microbes and receives minerals and vitamins in return. Beautiful system, and you can see it function there in that image on the right. Rock weathering by bacteria and fungi, and the nutrient acquisition, mostly through the symbiotic fungi that are on the roots actually growing on the plant to deliver those nutrients as well. So from the beginning of the plant's life, there is a very big reliance on the plant-associated microbes. They harvest nutrients from the soil organic matter and the parent material, the sand, silt, and clay that's being decomposed for the plant. And they absorb all kinds of nutrients, and these are just a few: iron, boron, phosphate, calcium, potassium, of course, nitrogen and sulfur as well. Bacteria and fungi predators, so the organisms that feed on fungi and bacteria, we call them predators or grazers, excrete the excess nutrients that they gain from the bacteria and the fungi, and these are then directly absorbed by the plant roots. So you can imagine that this has to be happening all around the plant root itself. It's not somewhere far away. It's all happening within the micrometers of the plant roots. There's all different interactions going on for the plant and these tiny little microscopic organisms doing their jobs. Each plant species requires balanced proportions of decomposers and predators or grazers. So each of the plant families, each individual plant, even depending on what soil it's growing on, it will require its own little microhabitat that it will create for itself, and it knows what to give those organisms in order to receive the nutrients that it requires in a specific situation. And you can see here on the right in the image that we have, even at the level of a seed, there's already microbes present that need to actually release gases for the seed to even germinate. It's got its own little ecosystem within it, every seed. It should anyway, and if it doesn't proliferate well, or it has to wait for that microbial inoculation in the soil. So the germination is promoted, and also that reduces attack by organisms that want to decompose the seed. Also, these organisms that are essential for these seeds, for each individual seed, have hormonal balance regulation around that seed. So germination can only occur through microorganisms present on the dry seed, stimulating seed germination where water becomes available. And then bacteria from the soil also aid this process of germination and going into the seedling stage. And once the plant goes through the seedling stage, bacteria from the surrounding environment land on the plant as well. So the plant leaves, for example, have their own microbiome. The plant roots on the bottom right, you can see, have their own individual microbiome. All of the different organisms functioning to support the plant. It's almost like you can't really separate any of these entities. We can't just look at the plant because it relies so much on the microbiome of its own. And it is just a beautiful, beautiful system. So this interdependence is very, very important. It functions, and it has done for millions of years. So plant roots and detritus support 60% of microbial life. So basically that's your initial food source. The plant photosynthesizes, everything feeds on the sun, basically sun's energy transformed by the plants. So that 60% of microbial life in the soil is directly associated with the plant. So this happens through rhizodeposition. So this is where dead root debris and all kinds of things are exuded from the plant roots. Plant residues as well go into this. So everything that happens around the rhizosphere, so the root zone, and that becomes carbon and nutrients and water acquisition for the plant, because they release carbon, they require nutrients to be a part of the system, and as a community with the microbes, create conditions where water can be absorbed but also brought into the plants by roots and the symbiotic fungi that access water from way further than the roots. The plant microbe interactions should always be mutualistic, and the interactions between the microbes should also be mutualistic or beneficial. Mutualistic meaning they support each other rather than being parasitic, where they feed off each other and one partner benefits and the other one suffers. So everything that in a microbiome system works healthily is when everything contributes to the whole. There's no organisms sucking energy from any others. Everything's fed, everything's looked after, there's enough, there's abundance, and this is how a healthy ecosystem, a healthy body of any organism works. So plant nutrition is ensured through this process, and also the microbes that live on the plant and support the plant and within the plant also, they compete and suppress and predate on any pathogenic potential. So any organisms that might come in because someone just added a lot of pathogens into the soil, that won't touch the plant. It won't matter at all because all these organisms are protecting their host. It's a beautiful system. And in the image on the right, we have those interactions just shown basically that above ground, the phyllosphere or the leaf sphere has got all the microbiome of its own, the endosphere, all the microbes throughout the plant, are functional and happy and living inside. And then there's a rhizosphere, which is the root zone. So let's revise also, because part of this ecosystem and to support this ecological community of plants and microbes, we need to have the soil organic matter present. And we've already learned a little bit about it, but let's just recap it because it's so important. So it accumulates, and it's accumulated from above ground as the plant drops and the plant debris decays through the microbial processes. And it is dissolved or particulate. So dissolved is like exudates and leachate. Say something's being decomposed and then it leaches out its contents. And the roots exude its contents. But that only comprises less than 2% of the soil organic carbon. The rest is particulate. So it is what drops down in the form of leaves that are senesced or dead litter or any stubble or anything like that from the plant. There's also energy and nutrients that are being transferred from this organic matter straight to the decomposers. So obviously the bacteria and fungi feed on all this organic matter, and that's what they require to be fed by. And so organic matter can be said that it's a product of microbial decomposition because it is the plant inputs dominated by microbial molecules that the microbes then form as a result of taking some energy out of this process, out of debris, out of the organic matter. And through that process of decomposition, they actually create new microbial substances that are now ready to go and be used in the soil. The microbial death process, the necromass, or the dead body mass that is created by the microbes that pass, die away, or are eaten, like everything that dies basically, has a huge contribution to soil organic carbon. Especially in like temperate forests, this accounts for 30% of soil organic carbon, this dead matter from organisms. And in grasslands, up to 62% of this dead organism matter is actually a contribution of stable organic carbon. The top 100 centimeters of soil contains about 50% of the terrestrial carbon pool. So in that meter, remember at the beginning we said it was a meter of the soil layer that feeds the world. And that's basically where the carbon sits as well. 50% of that carbon, of all of the Earth's carbon, terrestrial I should say, which is basically not including oceans, sits in that meter, top 100 centimeters. The decomposed residues, as they're being decomposed by the organisms, by the microbes, have reduced energy content, obviously because the organisms have taken the carbon and transformed it now. But this increases their reactivity with the mineral matrix of the soil, and that actually leads to carbon sequestration that stays in the soil for long periods of time, and we'll show you that in a second. So let's look at what the difference is between soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. So soil organic matter is calculated based on the soil organic carbon content. So soil organic matter is actually 58% carbon, and it is bound to other elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And the organic matter values are around 1.72 times greater than the soil organic carbon values. So obviously carbon is part of that organic matter, so there's less of that carbon. So soil organic matter percentage then equals total soil organic carbon times 1.72. And this is just your calculation to show you what the difference is between the soil organic carbon and how it's calculated in soil organic matter. So particulate organic carbon is the residues, once again, just to recap, fresh residues, living organisms, and it's labile. So that means it's transformable. It will die, it will be changed, it will be decomposed. And that only lasts, that soil organic matter, for about 5 years in the soil. Very short-lived experience for that organic matter, obviously, as it's getting decomposed. But then there's humus, and we talked about this in the last lesson in more detail, where there's that humus organic carbon, which is more resistant. It is physically protected as well in soil aggregates, and it has a slower decomposition time. Up to 40 years it can stay in the soil. But then we have resistant organic carbon, and that's what already has been protected. So the humus has been made particular by fungi, but bacteria a little bit as well. And there's also charcoal, things that have burnt and stayed. But majority of it in ecosystems, the useful, really useful organic matter that stays there and is recalcitrant or not readily broken down and can stay in the soil for 1,000 years or more, is here in this resistant organic carbon protected humus. So we want as much of that as possible to make that spongy, beautiful soil to support life. So what does soil organic matter do? We once again covered that earlier, but I'm just going to go through it again. It is basically dependent on how much the soil is disturbed. Any cultivation of the soil or a removal of any of the organic matter that falls or stays in the soil by just leaving the plant stubble. If we remove those things, it will actually mean that we will produce bacterial dominance. So bacteria will pretty much predominate in that soil. But if we leave that food, that organic matter, and reduce tillage, disturbance of any of the soil, we will actually increase fungal dominance. We'll actually make this system more robust. Fungi grow slower and are much more efficient in carbon decomposition than bacteria. So the diversity of fungi and bacterial communities very much depends on how we manage that soil. This also drives disease and weed suppression, so that fungal to bacterial biomass ratio really drives whether disease and weeds are present. So once again, this is something we can manage, and we can increase soil organic carbon by having these practices where our cultivation is reduced and our stubble retention occurs. So once again, we can modulate this. We can very much have an influence on this function of the soil organic matter. But its function in itself is food provision for the organisms and basically a home and habitat that organic matter will create for those organisms to live in and function. So bacteria and fungal predators release mineral nitrogen immobilized in microbes. So also it very much drives, by giving food to the bacteria and fungi, predators that will then release those nutrients for the plant from the microbes. Because remember, the microbes take these into their bodies, and if they're alive and thriving and using that, they're not really releasing that for the plant. So nitrogen mineralization from soil organic matter and residues increases crop nitrogen uptake, and this is the mineralization occurs through these predators. And increased carbon and soil structure leads to microbial diversity, growth, and activity, including nitrogen cycling. So I've introduced it through a sort of a back way, but just to show you that we can't disturb that ecosystem in order to gain all these benefits. And here, once again, we have this representation of this organic matter and in what way it is present in soil, in which form. So the particulate organic matter is basically, once again, stuff that falls and the root debris that comes down and all the leaf litter and everything else. And it's very short-lived. Here in this example, it says it lasts 50 years, so it just depends on how it's studied and what environment it's in and how much it can be degraded and how quickly. It is kind of light because it's all just bigger molecules stuck together. And it is complex, definitely. In a leaf, it will be fully complex, and in wood, yes, it will be very, very complex. It provides carbon and nitrogen, but this is what it is. It falls down to the ground, it gets shredded by fragmenting insects that have the mouth parts to shred it up. But it's really the microbes that will then take it and really churn it. They'll take off every single other element, and then that will just be left with this very, very sort of no more decomposition can happen, and that will then chelate or attach to mineral particles, which we call mineral associated organic matter. And that can last up to 1,000 years, probably more. Once again, these are just figures thrown around. And it's heavier in the sense that it's got this mineral content now, and it's now stuck together. And it's less complex only because the microbes have stripped it all up, stripped up all the complexity out of it from the leaf residue. And once again, it's rich in carbon and nitrogen. And so really how these two forms of organic matter are decomposed, how they are shredded up, how the microbial community can deal with it, the microbe types that are present, the fungal to bacterial biomass ratio, the carbon dioxide that's released from that interaction will really much depend on all that biodiversity that's present, and of course the plant type, everything. So just to give you this very nice overview of really how it happens, I want you to understand that the microbes play such an important part, and not just the microbes, but the organisms that eat the microbes and the shredder organisms that shred the organic matter. It's all dependent on these organisms being looked after. So the soil habitat really is, if the plants are lacking and there's very little organic matter in the soil, it's like a biological desert. So while definitely there's still lots of microbes present, it's the plants really that attract the microbes to them. This organic matter on the plant exudates are what feeds the microbes. So anything without these components is going to just be desert, a microbial desert. Microbes are tiny also. That's another reason why it is a desert, because microbes are so small and they cover the surface area of mineral particles. So the volume compared to the amounts of sand, silt, and clay is going to be obviously tiny in comparison. But these soil particles, if they have these two components present, they actually attract those microbes to specific little areas. And that allows for collaborative community, which is difficult in the desert. So for them to actually function, you need that root, you need that organic matter, you need that food for them to be attracted and start collaborating and working their magic. So these interactions drive ecosystem services. So this is so important, that those microbes are given the right food, that they are functioning properly so the plants can keep providing that food, and then the rest of the ecosystem can function really well. We can grow great crops, we can grow great biodiversity from that, and nothing else needs to be added. This cohabitation in the soil aggregates particularly, and where there's pores present in the soil, like you can see here, where the roots are going through and the soil particles are lovely and stuck together because of this organic matter being present and the microbes making glues as they consume this organic matter. That creates that cohabitable space for them to be protected, and the organic matter and the carbon that the organic matter has is now protected within these aggregates. And also pores are formed as the roots go through, and worms and other organisms, micropores and bigger pores are formed, allowing for habitat formation. So microbes create these microaggregates because the bacteria actually secrete glues. Remember the biofilm concept, where they're making their glues to live in that habitat for themselves, to communicate through, to be really adhered to these particles, so they don't just, every time there's a bit of water, they'll just flush out. They want to stay there, so they're making these glues and they're communicating through these glues. They're eating, they're able to sort of excrete enzymes and consume different foods through that, different minerals. And the macroaggregates are what the hyphae, or the fungal cells that are long and train-like, in a sense of the cells being one behind the other, making long networks. They can now weave around those little microaggregates. And as they weave around, they basically produce these macroaggregates holding smaller particles in a number together, making a macroaggregate producing pores for water and oxygen to enter. And you can see that really well here. There's water in these as the aggregates are separated out by bacterial glues. And then microbes can grow in there. They can be happy in there because they've got enough moisture to survive. Remember, we'll talk about this later, but all of these really little organisms are aquatic. They live in water. So biopores are something that are formed by roots going through the soil. So that's another slide showing the habitat of soil for soil microbes. So there's a big pore there, there's a pore there, and then worms, as they move through, they're actually forming these biopores as well. But earthworms, termites, roots, ants, they provide this bigger picture structure. They allow water and oxygen and nutrients to be exchanged in those sides by the microorganisms, and also they just provide the access of the soil to water and oxygen. Root access to subsoil water and nutrients as well, because they can grow deeper when there's more pores, more porosity in the soil, where the structure is nice and spongy. The roots can access deeper parts of the soil getting nutrients. And also the biopores eliminate and reduce compaction, or prevent it even. But when the structure is already compacted, like in agricultural systems, allowing these organisms to come through, they will actually increase that. But when we actually do the destruction and the compaction, these organisms and root access is reduced greatly. So we can't just keep destroying the ecosystem, and the biopores actually disappear when we start tilling and driving over it and putting a lot of pressure on the system. Hooves of animals, yes, they will compact the soil. We need to preserve this biopore structure. It's literally a network, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. So decomposing roots and new roots, where they interact, it's where the rhizosphere and detritosphere interacts. And all of this enhances beneficial microbial functions, obviously. We've got these spaces now for water and oxygen to enter, and all of the organisms require water and they require oxygen as well in the soil. And the plant definitely needs oxygen. So microbial habitat can be actually almost seen just by holding a soil macro aggregate. And the soil spheres, basically the different things we can say exist because we can see them. Over 90% of the soil biological activity actually occurs in these different areas, and they need organic matter and moisture and oxygen. And when it's too dry, there's little activity. And when it's too wet and it's compacted, we have lack of oxygen, so also reduces activity. But when we have this sponge, because the detritosphere and the rhizosphere, where the roots and the organic matter meet up here, that interaction between the roots getting all of this churned. Look at the beautiful fungal hyphae. These are all these tiny little fungal hyphae, web-like formations growing throughout this beautiful aggregate. And this is just to show like where the aggregates are formed. So sort of like an example, you can kind of almost map them out. The drillosphere is the worms, what they've created, the big holes that they create, and they stay that way. And if the fungi on the roots are also there, they'll also be accessing this nutrient for the plant right from those little aggregates, because that's where the little organisms are feeding on the bacteria, and then the nutrients are released and taken to the plant. And so the rhizosphere is obviously extending throughout the aggregate, and there's porospheres, which are pores made by the roots going through, as well as the worms as well, but mostly the porosphere is created by the roots. So you can see that you can divide a beautiful giant soil aggregate into different spheres or different places for organisms to live. That's probably the best way to describe what these spheres are, where the organisms can function best, and different organisms will be in different nooks and crannies. So once again, your biodiversity increases. And this is just a beautiful image to show that sometimes there's even mammals and there's all kinds of other creatures that participate in this, not just the microbes. And we will go into that in our next lesson. And of course, any anaerobic organisms will not be able to dominate unless we lack that structure, unless we lack the oxygen when it's too wet and compacted. So this is so important to keep this beautiful system alive by not damaging it, by not disrupting it, by allowing it to do what it does, by giving it as much plants as possible. Because as soon as that's disrupted, we get anaerobic conditions forming, and then in those anaerobic conditions, we get bacteria that dominate, that are actually going to decompose our plant, not because they're evil, but because the plant itself without oxygen cannot survive, so it's dying. And so we call these organisms pathogens, but really are they pathogens when they're just doing their job in decomposing something? If these organisms didn't decompose the dying root, what would happen then? We need them to decompose the unhealthy plant that's dying. The plant signals, I'm dying, I have no oxygen, I have nowhere to go, I'm stuck in waterlogged situation. Of course it's going to die. It's much better that something actually eats it and makes use of it. So this is why we have what we call pathogens. Okay, so we have now come to the end of lesson 2.1. And in our next lesson, we'll look at the soil food web concept, how the ecological interactions of different organisms that comprise the soil food web look like. And we'll look at the different trophic levels or the feeding levels specifically for all those different groups of organisms. And we'll look at the biota divisions. So all the different organisms, how do they fit into the trophic levels? How do they feed upon each other in terms of their size and their function in the ecosystem, in that soil food web, in that ecological aspect of soil? Okay, so you shall be hearing from me in lesson 2.2. Bye for now.